The wind was a blade, sharp and merciless, slicing through the threadbare wool of their cloaks. 10 women, black-clad specters against a world of white, staggered through the blizzard, their prayers swallowed by the howl of the Montana winter. Sister Agnes led them, her face a mask of frozen determination, though inside her heart was a tiny, frightened bird beating its wings against the cage of her ribs. Each step was an agony of frozen limbs and burning lungs. Behind her, the soft weeping of Sister Catherine was a counterpoint to the shriek of the gale, and the labored breathing of the elderly Mother Helen was a ticking clock, counting down their final moments. They had been cast out, driven from the small convent they had built with their own hands by a man whose soul was as barren as the winter landscape. Bartholomew Thorne, a man of wealth and wicked entitlement, had seen their land not as a sanctuary for God, but as a prize for his expanding cattle empire. He had used his influence to turn the nearby town against them, whispering lies of heresy and greed until the people who had once brought them gifts now threw stones. They had fled with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a faith that was now being tested to its absolute limit. The snow was a relentless shroud, burying the world and their hopes with it. Agnes stumbled, catching herself on a half-buried pine branch, her own strength failing. They were a flock without a shepherd, lost in a wilderness that did not know God. Just as the last ember of hope began to die within her, a flicker of light, impossibly distant, impossibly warm, cut through the swirling snow. It was a pinprick of gold in a universe of cruel white, a promise so faint it could have been a hallucination born of cold and despair. But it was there. With the last of her will, Agnes raised a trembling arm and pointed. For the other 9 women, it was more than a light. It was a sign, a miracle in the heart of the void. They turned their faces toward it, a shared, unspoken prayer binding them together, and began to walk once more, their steps now fueled by the thinnest, most desperate sliver of grace. Have you ever considered what happens when the most devout faith collides with the most profound solitude? This is a story about that collision. It is a story of a man who had built a fortress around his heart, and the 10 women who, seeking shelter from a storm, accidentally laid siege to it. It is a tale of how a place of exile can become a sanctuary, and how a man who had forgotten how to live can be taught again by those who had lost everything but their hope. Join us as we uncover the story of Silas Blackwood and the Sisters of Mercy, and ask ourselves if the most barren ground can, through love and courage, be made to bloom. The light led them to a small, solitary cabin, hunkered down against the fury of the storm like a stubborn beast. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, a fragile ribbon of life in the overwhelming desolation. The cabin and the sprawling, snow-dusted ranch around it seemed not so much built upon the land as grown from it, a place of profound and intimidating loneliness. Agnes, her knuckles white, knocked on the heavy wooden door. The sound was swallowed by the wind. She knocked again, harder, putting all her remaining strength into the blow. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, the sound of a heavy bar being lifted from within, and the door creaked open a few inches. A man stood there, silhouetted against the warm light of a lantern. He was tall and broad, his face a landscape of harsh lines and shadows, a thick, untrimmed beard hiding his mouth. But it was his eyes that held Agnes captive. They were the color of a winter sky just before the sun dies, a flat, unforgiving gray that held no welcome, only a deep and abiding weariness. He looked at the 10 freezing women, his gaze lingering on Agnes, and a muscle twitched in his jaw. He was a man who had not seen another soul in a long, long time, and clearly had no desire to start now. He was Silas Blackwood, a name whispered in the nearest town, with a mixture of fear and pity. A rancher, a recluse, a man haunted by ghosts only he could see. The storm that had driven the 10 women to Silas Blackwood's door was not a fleeting squall. It was a siege laid by nature itself. For 3 days and 3 nights, the wind howled like a hungry wolf, and the snow fell in a suffocating curtain, erasing the world and trapping the unlikely inhabitants of the small cabin together in a space thick with unspoken words and palpable tension. Silas had allowed them to stay, not out of charity, but out of a grudging sense of necessity he couldn't quite articulate. He was a man who had long ago made a pact with silence and solitude, and the presence of these 10 women, with their soft rustling, their quiet prayers, and their pervasive scent of piety and fear, was an intrusion of the highest order. He gave them the main room, with its large stone fireplace, while he relegated himself to a small, cold storage room off the back, his bed a pile of old blankets, and his companion the ceaseless drumming of the wind. The narrator sees into his heart, a place far colder than any winter. Years ago, this cabin had echoed with the laughter of a wife and the patter of a small son's feet, but the diphtheria had come like a thief in the night, stealing them both and leaving Silas in a silence so profound it had become his very skin. He had buried them on the hill overlooking the ranch, and with them, he had buried his own heart. He saw these women not as souls to be saved, but as a painful reminder of a life and warmth he had lost. He moved among them like a shadow, his words clipped and rare, his face an unreadable mask of stone. The nuns, in turn, were terrified of him. They saw not a grieving man, but a wild one, a hermit whose eyes held a bleakness that seemed to mirror the storm outside. They huddled together near the fire, speaking in whispers, their gratitude for the shelter warring with their fear of their host. Agnes, however, watched him. She saw the way his large, calloused hands stilled when he looked at the fire, the flicker of some deep, ancient pain in his winter-gray eyes. She learned of their own plight through their whispered conversations. The name Bartholomew Thorne was a venomous hiss on their lips. He had not only taken their home, but had poisoned their name, ensuring no other town would take them in. They were exiles, branded and cast out. On the third morning, the storm's fury lessened to a mournful sigh. The snow had stopped. A pale, watery sunlight filtered through the single grime-streaked window. The world outside was a pristine, silent expanse of white. Silas emerged from his room, pulling on a heavy sheepskin coat. "The storm's broke," he grunted, his voice rough from disuse. "You'll need to be on your way." Agnes rose, her small frame radiating a dignity that belied their desperate situation. "On our way to where, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "The town cast us out. The nearest settlement is a week's journey, a journey we would not survive." Silas looked away from her, his gaze fixed on the unforgiving landscape. "That's not my concern." But it was. As he looked at the vast, empty snow, he didn't just see a path for them to leave. He saw a white, endless graveyard. He saw the faces of his wife and son, their lips blue, their bodies still. A flicker of something, not kindness, but a deep, primal rejection of seeing death visit his land again, stirred in the frozen soil of his soul. He let out a long, weary breath that plumed in the cold air. "The barn," he said, without turning to look at them. "You can stay in the barn until the thaw." He did not wait for an answer, striding out the door and leaving the 10 women in a state of stunned, hopeful silence. It was not a welcome, but it was a reprieve. It was a stay of execution, and for now it was enough. The thaw was not a singular event, but a slow, grudging retreat of winter. The snow melted in patches, revealing the hard, brown earth beneath, and the air, while still cold, lost its razor's edge. The 10 nuns moved into the large, drafty barn, a space that smelled of hay, dust, and animal warmth. It was a Spartan existence, but compared to the blizzard, it was a palace. Silas kept his distance, a solitary figure moving through his daily chores, with a grim, practiced efficiency. He believed that by creating physical distance, he could maintain the emotional fortress he had spent years constructing. But life, he was beginning to discover, was a persistent weed, capable of growing in the most inhospitable of places. The first crack in his armor came not from a word, but from a simple act. He had a small flock of sheep, their wool thick and matted. Shearing was a task he despised, a lonely struggle with panicked, heavy animals. He was wrestling with a particularly stubborn ewe when he felt a presence behind him. It was Agnes, her hands clasped, her expression one of quiet observation. "We could help," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Silas grunted, not looking at her. "Don't need it." But the ewe bucked, its hoof catching him in the shin, and he cursed under his breath. The next day, Agnes was there again, and with her were Sister Mary, a practical woman with strong, capable hands, and Sister Elizabeth, whose gentle nature seemed to soothe the animals. They did not ask for permission this time. They simply picked up the shears, their movements clumsy at first, but filled with a quiet determination. Silas watched from the corner of his eye, his disapproval warring with a grudging respect. They worked all day, their black robes soon covered in lanolin and bits of hay. By dusk, the entire flock was shorn, huddled together in a clean pen, their new lightness a palpable thing. That evening, for the first time, Silas did not eat alone in his cabin. He brought a pot of venison stew out to the barn and set it on a makeshift table. He ate with the nuns in near total silence, the only sounds the clinking of spoons against tin bowls and the soft crackle of the lantern. Yet the silence was different. It was no longer the empty, echoing silence of his grief, but a shared, companionable quiet. Agnes dared to break it. "The sheep look well," she said. He nodded, not meeting her eyes. "You have a good flock." Another nod. "This is good land," she continued, her gaze sweeping over the dark expanse of the barn. "It feels strong." For the first time, he looked directly at her. In the flickering lantern light, her face was earnest, her eyes clear. She was not trying to flatter him or trick him. She was simply stating a truth. "My father thought so," he said, the words feeling strange and rusty in his throat. "And his father before him." It was the most he had spoken in years, a tiny offering of his history laid bare on the dusty air between them. When he returned to his cabin that night, the silence within its walls felt different, heavier, and for the first time in a long time, it felt lonely. The thaw had begun not just in the valley, but in the frozen landscape of Silas Blackwood's heart. The days that followed fell into a new rhythm, a quiet melody composed of shared work and growing trust. The nuns, with an industry born of years of communal living, began to subtly transform the ranch. They were no longer just guests seeking shelter. They were becoming part of the land itself. Under the guidance of Sister Mary, they cleared a patch of ground near the barn, turning over the dark, rich soil with determined hands, preparing it for a spring garden. They sang quiet hymns as they worked, the gentle sound a stark contrast to the profound silence that had reigned in the valley for so long. Silas would find himself pausing in his work, listening to the unfamiliar sound, a strange ache spreading through his chest. It was not the pain of grief, but something else, something new and unsettlingly warm. They mended his clothes, patching the worn elbows of his shirts with neat, almost invisible stitches. They cleaned the cabin, an act he initially resisted but eventually relented to, returning one evening to find the grime of years scrubbed from the windows and the floor swept clean. It was as if they were not just cleaning a physical space, but airing out the stale atmosphere of his sorrow. The most significant shift came with Agnes. She did not confine herself to the women's work of the garden and the cabin. She followed Silas on his daily rounds, a silent apprentice. She learned to mend the fences that webbed the property, her small hands surprisingly deft with the wire and pliers. He watched her, his gruff exterior belying a growing admiration for her resilience. She did not complain of the cold, or the dirt, or the hard labor. She simply worked, her presence a quiet, constant challenge to his isolation. One afternoon, he was checking the perimeter for signs of predators, a heavy rifle resting in the crook of his arm. A wolf pack had been growing bolder, their tracks appearing closer and closer to the sheep pens. Agnes walked beside him, her gaze sharp. "You should teach me," she said, her voice clear and direct. Silas stopped, turning to face her. "Teach you what?" "To use that," she said, nodding at the rifle. He almost laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "A nun with a gun? What would God say about that?" Agnes met his cynical gaze, without flinching. "I believe God helps those who help themselves, Mr. Blackwood. We are 10 women, alone and unprotected. You are one man. If that wolf pack decides to attack, or if a man like Mr. Thorne ever finds us, your honor will not be enough to save us." Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. She was right. His solitary strength was a finite resource. Protecting them was not just about providing a roof. It was about giving them the means to protect themselves. He saw in her not a fragile woman of God, but a fierce survivor, a spirit as untamed as the land itself. He spent the rest of the afternoon teaching her. He showed her how to hold the rifle, how to brace it against her shoulder, how to breathe, aim, and squeeze the trigger. The weapon was heavy in her arms, but she did not falter. Her first shot missed the target tree entirely, kicking up a spray of dirt. Her second struck the very edge. Her third hit the center with a satisfying thud. A slow, small smile touched her lips, and Silas felt something in his chest lurch. In that moment, as she stood there, smelling of gunpowder and pine, her nun's habit a strange uniform in this wild place, he saw not Sister Agnes, but simply Agnes. And he knew, with a certainty that terrified him, that his life was no longer his own. The slow-burning fire of their connection grew warmer with each passing week. Spring arrived in earnest, painting the valley in shy greens and vibrant wildflowers. The garden the nuns had planted began to sprout, a testament to their faith and labor. The ranch, once a monument to one man's grief, was now a humming hive of activity, a place of rebirth. The found family was no longer a temporary arrangement, but a deeply rooted reality. The younger nuns looked to Silas as a gruff but steadfast father figure, and he, in turn, found himself feeling a fierce, paternal protectiveness for them. But his feelings for Agnes were different, something more complex and profound. Their conversations, once clipped and practical, now meandered into the territory of the heart. They would often sit on the porch of the cabin in the evenings, watching the stars ignite in the vast, dark sky. He would speak of the land, of the way the seasons turned, of the language of the animals. It was his Bible, the only scripture he had known since his faith had died with his family. She, in turn, would speak of her God, but her descriptions had changed. She found holiness not just in a chapel, but in the resilience of a sprouting seed, in the loyalty of a sheepdog, in the quiet strength of a man who had opened his home to strangers. They were finding a common ground, a shared spirituality woven from earth and sky, work and grace. One evening, a sudden spring storm rolled in, a dramatic clash of thunder and lightning. They were caught out near the river, checking a line of traps. They took shelter in a small, shallow cave carved into the riverbank, the rain falling in a silver curtain across the entrance. They sat in close proximity, the scent of damp earth and ozone filling the small space. "I used to be afraid of storms," Agnes said, her voice soft over the drumming of the rain. "I saw them as God's anger." "And now?" Silas asked, his voice a low rumble. She turned to look at him, her face illuminated by a sudden flash of lightning. Her eyes were deep and searching. "Now," she said, "I think they are just a reminder that even the sky has to cry sometimes, that even the strongest things have to release their pain." In that moment, the wall he had so carefully maintained around his heart crumbled to dust. He saw not a nun, not a symbol of a faith he'd abandoned, but a woman who understood the language of his own sorrow. He reached out, his calloused fingers hesitating for a second before gently brushing a stray, rain-dampened strand of hair from her cheek. It was a simple, fleeting touch, but it carried the weight of years of unspoken loneliness and a future of unspoken hope. The air crackled with an energy that had nothing to do with the storm outside. It was a silent acknowledgement, a promise of a spring that was about to dawn in both their hearts. Just as the rain began to subside, their fragile peace was shattered. A lone rider, a trader named Jedediah, was making his way toward the ranch, his wagon laden with goods. He was a welcome sight, a link to the outside world. As they shared a meal that night, Jedediah spoke of news from the towns to the east. "There's a rich fella, a landowner named Thorne," he said, oblivious to the sudden tension in the room. "He's been turning the whole county upside down, offering a king's ransom for any word on a group of nuns that run off from him. Says they stole from him. He's a mean one, that Thorne. Possessive. Acts like he owned those women, body and soul." The name fell like a stone into the quiet pool of their existence. Agnes's face went pale. Silas looked at her, and in her eyes, he saw the return of the same fear he had seen on the night they arrived. His hand, resting on the table, slowly curled into a fist. The past, which had seemed so distant, was now a tangible threat, a storm cloud gathering on the horizon, promising a tempest far more destructive than the one they had just weathered. The news brought by the trader hung in the air like a shroud. The fragile peace of the valley was broken, replaced by a low, simmering anxiety. The hymns the nuns sang as they worked had a new, more plaintive note, and the laughter of the younger sisters was now hushed and infrequent. Bartholomew Thorne was no longer a ghost from a painful past. He was a hunter, and they were his prey. The knowledge that he was actively searching for them, poisoning their name with lies of theft, solidified their isolation. There was no escape, no town they could flee to. This ranch, this small pocket of the world governed by a quiet, wounded man, was their only sanctuary. It was their last stand. Silas watched the fear take root in them, and it ignited a cold fury within him. These women, who had brought life and light back to his desolate world, would not be terrorized. His protective instinct, once a reluctant stirring, now roared to life like a dormant volcano. The solitude he had once cherished now seemed like a foolish indulgence. His purpose, which he thought he had buried on the hill with his family, was suddenly, starkly clear. He was a protector. It was who he was, in his bones, in the very soil of the land his family had worked for generations. He began to fortify the ranch. The work was no longer about simple maintenance. It was about defense. He reinforced the doors of the cabin and the barn. He built higher, stronger fences around the sheep pens. He cleaned and oiled every weapon he owned. The heavy rifle, a pair of old pistols, and a shotgun he kept for scaring off coyotes. He moved with a grim, silent determination that was both frightening and reassuring to the nuns. He was becoming the man he used to be, a man who knew the harsh realities of the world and was prepared to meet them head-on. Agnes, seeing this transformation, refused to be a passive observer waiting for rescue. The woman who had trembled in a blizzard was gone, replaced by a leader forged in hardship and a dawning love. "We will not hide while you fight for us," she declared to him one morning, her chin set with resolve. The other nuns stood behind her, their faces a mixture of fear and courage. "We are not helpless. We are a part of this home now. We will defend it with you." So began a new, more urgent phase of their training. Silas, his voice terse and direct, taught them not just to load and fire a gun, but to think like defenders. He showed them the ranch's blind spots, the best vantage points from the loft of the barn, how to create diversions. Sister Mary, with her practical mind, organized the others into a cohesive unit. Some were tasked with barricading windows, others with preparing medical supplies, and a few of the younger, faster sisters were trained as lookouts. Agnes became his second in command. She patrolled the perimeter with him, the rifle now comfortable in her hands. She learned to read the land as he did, to spot a broken twig, to recognize the anxious cry of a jay that signaled an intruder. In the evenings, they would stand together on the porch, their shoulders nearly touching, watching the sun bleed across the western sky. The romance that had been a tender, budding thing was now being forged in the crucible of impending conflict. It was a bond not of whispered sweet nothings, but of shared responsibility and of fierce, mutual respect. "I won't let him take you," Silas said one night, his voice a low growl. It was not a promise, it was a vow. Agnes looked at him, her heart swelling with a feeling so powerful it almost frightened her. "He will not be fighting one man," she replied, her voice steady. "He will be fighting a family." The inevitable arrived on a hot, breathless afternoon. A lookout, the young sister Catherine, perched in the high branches of a pine tree on the ridge, let out a sharp, piercing cry. It was not a cry of fear, but the signal they had practiced, the call of a hawk. Silas heard it from the barn where he was sharpening an axe, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel ceasing abruptly. Agnes heard it in the garden, her hands still caked with dirt. A silent, electric understanding passed through the small community. The time for preparation was over. Down in the valley, a plume of dust rose from the east, a dirty smudge against the brilliant blue sky. It was a party of riders, at least a dozen men, moving with the arrogant swagger of those who believe their will is law. At their head rode a man on a magnificent black horse, a man whose expensive suit and polished boots were an insult to the rugged landscape. It was Bartholomew Thorne. He rode as if he already owned the valley, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. He had them. He had tracked his property to this miserable little hovel, and he would reclaim what was his. As they drew closer, Silas stepped out from the cabin, the shotgun held loosely in his hands. He stood alone in the center of the yard, a solitary, unmovable object. Agnes and 2 other nuns were in the barn loft, their rifles resting on bales of hay, their sights trained on the approaching men. The others were barricaded in the cabin, ready with boiling water and whatever meager defenses they could muster. Thorn reined in his horse a safe distance away, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "Blackwood," he called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "I'm told you're harboring thieves. I've come for my property. Send out the women, and I'll forget I ever saw you." Silas's voice was flat and cold as river stone. "They're not your property, and you're not welcome on this land. Turn around and ride away." Thorn laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that startled the birds from the trees. "This land? This forgotten scrap of dirt? I'll own this whole valley by next year. Now, for the last time, send them out." He gestured to his men, who began to dismount, their hands going to the pistols at their hips. "They're not coming out," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "But you're welcome to try and come in." With that, he raised the shotgun. It was the signal. From the barn loft, a rifle cracked, the sound echoing across the valley. One of Thorn's men cried out and clutched his shoulder, his face a mask of shock. He had been shot not by the grim rancher, but by a woman in a black habit. The battle for the ranch had begun. It was not a glorious fight, but a desperate, brutal scramble for survival. Thorn's men, expecting to intimidate a lone hermit, were met with a coordinated and ferocious defense. They were peppered with gunfire from 2 different directions, their advance stalling in confusion. Silas used the terrain he knew so well, moving between the cabin and the outbuildings, his shots precise and deadly. But it was the nuns who turned the tide. Thorn, in his arrogance, had underestimated them completely. He saw them as chattel, as meek and subservient creatures. He did not see the fierce women they had become. When 2 of his men tried to storm the cabin, the door was thrown open, and they were met with a cascade of scalding water, their screams of agony a shocking sound in the afternoon air. Thorn, his face contorted with rage, finally spurred his horse forward, drawing his own ornate pistol, his eyes fixed on Silas. This was personal. He would put this backwoods savage down himself. But as he charged, another shot rang out, this one from the cabin window. The bullet struck Thorn's horse in the leg. The magnificent animal screamed and collapsed, throwing its rider to the ground. Thorn landed hard, the wind knocked out of him, his pistol flying from his hand. He looked up from the dirt, dazed and disbelieving, to see Sister Agnes stepping out of the cabin, the smoking rifle in her hands, her face not of a fearful nun, but of a vengeful angel. Her journey from damsel to defender was complete. The fall of their leader broke the spirit of Thorn's hired guns. Seeing him sprawled in the dirt, disarmed and defeated by a woman, they lost their bluster. They were mercenaries, not martyrs. With a few more warning shots fired from the barn, they scrambled for their horses and fled, leaving their employer to his fate. The sudden silence that fell over the valley was deafening, broken only by the whimpering of Thorn's injured horse and the heavy breathing of the defenders. The dust began to settle, revealing a scene of triumph and exhaustion. The threat was over. Silas walked slowly toward Thorn, the shotgun still held at the ready. Thorn pushed himself into a sitting position, his fine suit covered in dust, and his face a mess of disbelief and fury. "You'll hang for this, Blackwood," he spat, his voice trembling with rage. "All of you. Witches, the lot of you." Silas looked down at him, his gray eyes holding no pity, only a vast, cold contempt. "This is my land," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "And these are my people. The only law here today is the one that says we defend our own." He did not kill Thorn. To do so would be to sink to the man's level. Instead, he took his pistol and his money clip, leaving him with nothing. "Start walking," Silas ordered. "The next town is a 2-day journey. Maybe you'll learn something about being helpless along the way." Thorn, sputtering with impotent threats, was forced to his feet, and sent stumbling back down the path he had ridden in on, a disgraced tyrant banished from the sanctuary he had sought to destroy. As his pathetic figure disappeared over the rise, the tension finally broke. The nuns poured out of the cabin in the barn, their faces streaked with soot and tears, but their eyes shining with a fierce, victorious light. They had faced the monster from their past, and had not been found wanting. They had defended their home. In the middle of the yard, amidst the lingering smell of gunpowder, Silas and Agnes faced each other. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them. All the barriers, his grief, her vows, their fear, had been burned away in the heat of the conflict. He saw her, truly saw her, not as a sister of the church, but as the woman who had brought his soul back from the dead, the woman who had fought beside him, the woman he loved with a totality that shook him to his core. He reached for her, and she met him halfway. His arms, which had once seemed so intimidating, wrapped around her, pulling her into an embrace that was both a desperate homecoming and a promise for the future. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the scent of smoke and courage. "Agnes," he whispered, the name a prayer on his lips. She looked up at him, her eyes mirroring the depth of his own emotion, the strictures of her old life, the vows she had taken in a world that had ultimately betrayed her, felt like a distant memory. Her faith had not been lost. It had been transformed. It was no longer an abstract devotion to a distant god, but a fierce, tangible love for this man and this family, this piece of earth they had bled for. "Silas," she whispered back, and in that single word was a lifetime of acceptance, of belonging, of love. The sun began, its slow descent, bathing the battered but peaceful ranch in a soft, golden light. It was the dawn of a new life, earned not through prayer alone, but through courage, resilience, and the unshakable power of a found family. The years that followed were a long, beautiful answer to a prayer that had been whispered in a blizzard. The ranch did not just survive, it thrived. It became a beacon of hope in the rugged Montana landscape, a place known not for its reclusive owner, but for its vibrant community and unshakable spirit. The story of the 10 nuns and the solitary rancher who defeated a wealthy tyrant became a local legend, a tale told around campfires that spoke of the frontier's true power, the power of people to remake their lives and forge families from the unlikeliest of bonds. Silas and Agnes married the following spring, in a simple ceremony on the hill where his first family was buried. It was not a somber occasion, but one of profound peace, a joining of past and future. The other 9 women, having been formally released from their vows by a sympathetic traveling bishop who was moved by their story, found new and profound callings right there on the ranch. Sister Mary, with her practical genius, turned the small garden into a sprawling, profitable farm, its produce renowned in the surrounding towns. Sister Elizabeth's gentle nature made her a natural healer, and she established an infirmary that served not only the ranch but also prospectors and travelers who needed care. The younger sisters, led by a no longer timid Sister Catherine, started a small school in the expanded barn, educating the children of homesteaders who had begun to settle in the now safe and welcoming valley. The ranch became a community, a living, breathing testament to their collective resilience. The sound of children's laughter, something Silas never thought he would hear again, became the daily music of his life. He and Agnes had 2 children of their own, a boy with his father's steady gray eyes, and a girl with her mother's fierce and gentle heart. Silas was no longer the man carved from stone. The lines on his face were softened by laughter, his silence replaced by the easy contentment of a man who is deeply loved and has found his purpose. He was a patriarch, a husband, a father, a protector not just of a piece of land, but of a sprawling, unconventional, and deeply devoted family. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, he and Agnes would walk hand in hand to the crest of the hill. They would look down at the warm lights of the cabins and the schoolhouse, at the field sleeping under a blanket of stars, and they would remember the fury of the storm that had brought them together. They knew that love was not a gentle thing, but a force of nature as powerful as any blizzard, capable of tearing down the strongest walls and planting gardens in the most desolate of soils. Theirs was a happily ever after that had been earned, fought for, and built with their own hands, a love story written not in ink, but in the very earth of the land they called home. So, what can we learn from the story of Silas and Agnes? It teaches us that the deepest wounds can be healed, that the most formidable walls can be brought down by the persistent power of love and community. It shows us that true strength is not found in isolation, but in the courage to open our hearts and our homes to those in need. It's a reminder that family is not always the one we are born into, but the one we build through shared struggle and unwavering loyalty. Have you ever witnessed an act of kindness so profound it changed someone's life forever? Do you believe that even the most broken souls can find redemption and a second chance at happiness? This story says yes. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that celebrate the enduring power of the human spirit.